Hello, good morning, everyone. Good morning,
Good
good
morning.
morning, good morning. It's great to have you guys. My name is Lina Polimeni. I am the Chief Corporate Brand Officer for Lilly, for Eli Lilly and Company. And today I'm just thrilled to finally have this conversation with two great women and great friends from USC as well as Macro. Excuse me. I just want to acknowledge real quick Amanda Farran from Imagine Studios is not able to be with us today because she's feeling a little bit under the weather, so wasn't able to join. But we will have a great conversation today. So before I start, just introduction-wise, just wanted to make sure I introduce Dr. Stacy Smith from the USC Amber Inclusion Initiative, as well as Stacy Walker King from Macro. So welcome. Okay, so today we're approaching a topic that has been a huge passion point both for us at Lilly as well as I know for both of you, which is specifically the depiction of health in film and TV. And part of what started this conversation when we were first talking with Dr. Smith was just this first glimpse into the data that showed basically the lack of representation or really invisibility of disease when it comes to film and TV and culture in general. And so part of the premise for this was, I'm a big believer that culture and film and sports in general really influence culture and the kind of shared consciousness that people have around many topics, and health being one of them. And at Lilly, we are a medicine company that believes that health is the most important thing that we have as human beings and as a society. And we really put health above all, not just in terms of the efforts that we make in medicine, but also into when it comes to leaning into conversations where you may not necessarily find a medicine company usually, but where we think culture is created and conversations that influence culture. And so film and TV and entertainment was one of those conversations that I think are kind of unusual for maybe a pharma company to lean in, but we thought was important because that's really how we collectively form opinions, and that's a main driver of culture in general. And so when it comes to health specifically, if you think about just the general state of health, and if you look at health from the perspective of life, a lot of times from my perspective, what makes Lilly different, at least having been there for 20 years, is that we truly see a person on the other side of the prescription, and we truly feel that we have an understanding and a value for the fact that life is very precarious and that health is huge and important to life itself. Part of life is the absence of health sometimes and illness. And so when Dr. Stacy and Lilly, we started to have these conversations, a lot of what really struck out to me in the data was the fact that a lot of this is not even touched in film and is not even taken a look at when it comes to what happens in life in the absence of health. But that is something that happens to all of us in life. And because life inspires art and art inspires entertainment, we thought it was a great thing to take a look at. And so the first step was really understanding the data, and that's why we partner with the USC Amber Institute to run the study that we're about to unveil today and discuss with you guys today. So if you think about the fact that we are living much longer than we have ever lived as humans, but yet in America, for example, over 129 million people suffer from chronic diseases and are actually, having issues with their health that, threaten their longevity and their ability to live longer and happier life. It's really kind of a dichotomy that struck us in the sense that we see this longevity and the ability to live longer, yet a lot of chronic health diseases are not either tackled in television, or sometimes people don't understand the importance of prevention and just overall well-being in terms of preventing health. So as we're looking at the data, we saw that in obesity, in cancer, we saw things that we will discuss that shocked us in terms of, representation of cancer, atopic dermatitis, and other important diseases. And so, part of what we wanted to do was first and foremost understanding what is the actual representation, what is the data telling us, where I think this is really a groundbreaking study for that, something I haven't personally seen done before. And so extremely grateful to have been part of this. And then secondly, hopefully as we have this conversation today, we can start thinking about how do we jump into action after that. One thing I wanted to share is that as entertainment definitely has a role into shaping culture, at the same time, it can accelerate the understanding of health, but it can also impede it. So just to share a couple of numbers that were interesting to me as we first started discussing, in media specifically, when these topics are discussed, then you see an impact on how general behavior changes. So for example, Katie Curie's live stream colonoscopy in 2000 led to a 21% increase in the procedure of colonoscopy in general population. Or the fact that Angelina Jolie's share of breast cancer essay resulted in 64% rise in genetic testing. Or, which is probably my favorite one, the Barbie movie. After, the OBGYN scene in the movie, we saw a 154% increase in online searches for a gynecologist. So you see an immediate impact because, again, it's a shaping in culture, and therefore then it drives to action. So as we have this discussion today, I think one of the things I would love for everyone to keep in mind is that the data is hugely important, but it's even more so important because it will help us hopefully drive some change and drive some action. And Dr. Smith, I know you are a beacon of action and change within the entertainment community, and just really this ability of using the data as a way to drive change. So I wanted to maybe kick off this conversation by having you both introduce yourself, and maybe starting with you, Dr. Smith, to both a quick introduction as well as why did this project matter to you, and what drove your interest towards this?
Well, first off, thanks for having me, and it's been amazing to partner with Lily for many months now.
Yes.
It's great to finally be able to talk about the data. I have to acknowledge my co-authors that are here, but in particular Michael Sayers, who really led this project at the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative. I'm Dr. Stacy Smith. I'm the founder of the leading global think tank studying issues of equality in entertainment, whether it's movies, television, music, streaming content, etc. And I think for us, we've been studying issues of representation, gender, race, ethnicity, LGBTQ, plus age, people with disabilities, and mental health. And 5 years ago, as we all know, out of nowhere, many of us, if not all of us, right, globally, were driven to our homes to take shelter, right? And I don't watch a lot of content on live television, right? The broadcast networks, cable. I'm a streaming person and whatnot. And I found myself in a situation where, for the first time, I was having to caregive for an 85-year-old. And it started out with I could do my job and do caregiving. But as the pandemic progressed, right, as we stayed in and her health deteriorated, there was a realization that this is something that's so important that we're not talking about. And my mom had Lewy body dementia. One of the indicators we studied was dementia, which is essentially erased in media content. And then out of nowhere, my health actually took a turn completely unexpectedly. So I found myself with narratives, I had nothing to go to except Google, talk to friends, start reaching out to doctors. And we know that the media is most powerful in the absence of direct experience. So if I have no experience with something, and all I am to rely on is what I'm seeing on screen, because the 85-year-old had the television on 24/7, right? This is what happens. It really sensitized me to, and long before Lily called, I said to our team, we need to look at health. And so it was waiting for the right partner to come along aside of us, somebody who could really make this visible and be actionable for change that we wanted to work with. So when we heard, I think we jumped with enthusiasm, because this is something that affects everybody in a way that can be extremely serious, or it can be something minor with information that can be preventable for long term. And so I think that was really the catalyst. We had already said yes. It was waiting for the manifesting of the perfect company to come along to work with.
Awesome. Yes, and I mean, I feel like that was definitely a mutual feeling in terms of finding the right partnership. And then, Stacy, can you tell us a little bit more around your role at Macro? And then we started having conversations around, again, the importance of health and how media and production can impact that, and your thoughts around what drove you to this.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for having us as well. This is just such an important conversation. And I'm just honored to be here with you and with you, two women I admire greatly. I'm Stacy Walker King. I am Chief Brand Officer and co-founder of Macro. Macro, we are a media company based in Los Angeles, and our impetus behind our entire company is about representation of the stories that we tell, telling the fullness of the human experience. We make sure that we tell stories that are, as we talk about it, it's underrepresented groups. So it's Black people, Latino, Asian, people, the LGBTQ community, and beyond. And really just making sure that we are able to tell our stories and not have others to tell it for us, which had been something that we've seen throughout really the entire, time that there's been in the entertainment industry. So, when we were first approached by Lillian, when we were introduced, we were absolutely excited about this because, like I said, our mission is to tell stories, and people with disease, the millions and millions of people with disease, deserve for their stories to be told. I think one of the things that we think about in our office often is there are people who are living with disease that need their stories told. There are people that now are caring for or are in relationship with people, their stories are not told. And then, I think just that part that we don't, maybe like to think about is that there are people who disease will come into their life at one point and another. And so, I think a fervent belief for us is that I would never sit here and say that the entertainment industry saves lives. I'm not going to go that far and be crazy. But what I will say is that narrative change can spark cultural change. And in cultural change, what that does is that can create connection, that can change perception, and changed perceptions can spark actions that save lives. Yeah. So a long way to get to. This work is so important, and it's so core to the work that we do at our company.
Absolutely, and it is true. I mean, that's where, to your point, Dr. Smith, that's where we get our beliefs a lot of times and our overall narrative and framework that we operate under. And so maybe let's get into the study, because I think some of the data that we saw was shocking, honestly. And, some of that was intriguing. Some of that was just, I think, even more shocking than we had thought maybe going in. So, for example, out of thousands, over 8,000 speaking roles that have been examined by the study, less than 3% of roles had obesity, were representative of obesity, and less than 1% had cancer or atopic dermatitis or any other big diseases. So before we get into kind of the impact of that, Dr. Smith, as the lead author of the study, can you walk us a little bit through the methodology and the thought process behind the study?
Sure. I think it was important for us to do a large-scale study looking not only at the prevalence of the 5 disease states, so obesity, cancer, diabetes, atopic dermatitis, and dementia. And we had to take a global look at each of those 5 disease states because we knew that Lily might be, let's say, really concerned with breast cancer, right? But we knew we weren't going to see much cancer. So we had to capture every single instance imaginable. And so to that end, once we had the 5 disease states, we then conceptualized how do you define each of those, right? So that you know it when you see it. We then trained quite a few individuals to look at and be able to identify not only the portrayal itself, but the context surrounding the portrayal. Who's involved, right? Do they seek medical advice? Is there a caregiver present? Is there treatment involved? Do you actually see any sort of medicine or any sort of prescription for what the ailment is? Now, of course not, because when you don't see it at all, it's hard to have a context, right? But we went in really trying to capture as much information around the 5 disease states as possible. And what we did is we looked at the top 100 films of 2023 and the top 100 TV shows on both broadcast and cable, as well as streaming, to really give us, I think, a baseline, because the goal is not one and done. The goal is to start out with a steady drumbeat of information around these 5 disease states so that we can create change, right? And I think, Lena, you previewed, beautifully the findings. So let me just kind of rattle them off for you. 8,676 speaking characters. Only 2.8% of those speaking characters, right? We count every character that says one word. So it's a very low bar. Only 2.8% of those characters had obesity, when this is something 37% of the US population, right, are defined as obese. In terms of cancer, again, 8,676 speaking characters, only 14, yet 40% of men and women in the US, right, are going to deal with some form of cancer in their lifetime. Diabetes, 200 of the most popular TV shows and films, diabetes. Can anyone tell me the only film that diabetes appeared in? One film out of 100, 0 TV shows. Does anyone besides the people on my team know this answer? Killers of the Flower Moon. Molly Burkhart. Lily's character, right? You have this amazing Academy Award nominated actor, right, in terms of her indigenous background. What is equally as impressive is they brought the conversation about diabetes in terms of symptomatology, in terms of care, in terms of caregiving. That was a continued theme of a film that took place decades ago. There were no portrayals of atopic dermatitis, but 6 hints that were really problematic. Let me just make sure I read this right, because I want to make sure I convey the ridiculousness of how this is shown on screen. No one had it, but we could infer possibly 6 characters, because 5 had discolored skin patches, 4 had inflammation, 3 had itchiness, but some of them were caused by demon possession. And yet, the numbers of how many children and adults between 10, right, and 30%, depending on the category in the US, are affected by atopic dermatitis. So there's a disconnect, and dementia's equally problematic of what we see. There's a disconnect between what's going on in the world and what is in film and popular film and television. And we're not, of course, advocating that every story has to be a theme, but it just doesn't represent our experiences. It doesn't represent what humans are going through and the humans that are making the stories. It's not representing the content creators' experiences either. So there's a large disconnect. And are we confident in the data? At least 5 people watched every movie and TV show, either evaluating for representation or for the disease state. So we're confident when we say 76 speaking characters and only 14 had cancer. I'm only on the stage 99.9999999% certain as a scientist that's exactly what's there.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, which I think was what is so powerful about this initiative and this study is putting the data behind is not dissimilar to how we approach change as a medicine company. We know it's always grounded in data and how we look at action. So for me, I think, the data, I think I heard you saying, Dr. Smith, is kind of the disease of invisibility, that it's the affliction of, in the sense of the entertainment industry or film. What's striking to me in those numbers, Stacey, it's also like how dangerous and impactful they can be, not just in not discussing the diseases, but for example, let's talk about obesity. I think storytellers and the storylines that we have seen in the studies are yes, equally as powerful in depicting or not depicting, but at the same time, when you do have speaking characters that have obesity, to Dr. Smith's point, often they are depicted as the butt of the joke. So obesity itself is the butt of the joke. Or, there are unlikable characters. There are often, disproportionately black characters versus not. And they are depicted as, not likable or not having a partner or not having a job. So I think, as a company, you may have seen some of the films that we have debuted in advertising and trying to change how obesity is depicted or even just representing obese bodies within the conversation. We try to fight the stigma, but I think the biggest stigma really comes and is shaped sometimes by how the storylines are written. So you being, at the head of such a great production company, and notoriously, and just kind of as you share your passion and your mission at Macro, is making sure that underrepresented communities are seen and really empowering specifically Black storytellers within the ability to tell these type of stories. What is your take of the data, specifically when it comes to obesity? And then what would you like to see as it comes to change in production?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, and I think all of us feel this way, which is, really convicted. When you hear this, I mean, we were just talking about it last night, that I think of myself as a very discerning consumer of media. Right. And, I realized that I wasn't seeing it, but I didn't realize it was that stark. And so I think, one thing for us, with our company and really putting these storytellers, of color and from underrepresented groups out in front, is just the importance of being able to tell a complete story. I think that we have all seen, I know in the Black community, just the way diabetes is something that, you can't throw a rock without knowing a Black person who knows a Black person with diabetes, right? And so I think that when we look at our stories and how we know that the way that people with these diseases, the way that they actually live in life, that it is not told, it's not something that's told with always where, a finger is pointed at them that, it's their fault or that, they're a butt of a joke or anything like that. They don't just survive, they thrive. And so I think for people with these afflictions, with obesity, with diabetes, with, cancers, it's really important to show those stories. For us at our company, we really look at, where it starts from is we don't set out to just tell a story. We got to tell a story with a person who's obese and put him or her in the front of this, and they need to be a saint and they need to be that. I love nothing more than to see a real character, a flawed character told with nuance, one that, has the full human experience, falls in love, falls out of love, is, great at work and is actually a terrible dancer. I don't know. I want to see a full story of someone, but also not, hiding from what their disease is, but also not just sitting in it, because that's not the way we know in real life, the way that people live. Yes. And I again, I go back to, I'm so grateful for studies like this. Your work, Dr. Smith, has just been, the other studies that you've done, and I hope and pray that you will talk about it in the hour that we have with each other, and just how that has sparked change. And I'm just really excited that a company like yours has really taken that as a mantle of we need to make sure that this happens with people with disease, because it really does affect and touch every single one of us.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, and I just want to jump in too. And one of the findings that was so disturbing is that we've been studying invisibility of different groups for years, right? And we do this kind of invisibility index where out of the top 100 films every year, we say how many films are missing this community, whether it's the Black community or the Asian community or LGBTQ plus community. And the thing that is so disturbing about the data for this project is that Black speaking characters clock in at about 15%, but of obese characters, 27% are Black. Yeah. And that is a problem, because that reflects who's making decisions behind the camera, because you should see about 15% of characters that are obese that also happen to be Black. But no, you have an over-indexing. So I think part of this conversation too is how do we ensure that people behind the camera reflect the experiences. And because Hollywood has been homogeneous for so long, right? We see these stereotypical portrayals no matter what angle we look at. And so it's really important to think about places like Macro, ensuring that you have the full richness of humanity in storytelling, because the data make me nervous, right? In that we need more authenticity behind the camera, essentially, to make sure on screen looks different.
Absolutely. And just one, other thing that I'll just add to that. I mean, just listening to the statistic that you gave about when people are able to see this in media and how it sparks change.
Yes.
The Barbie story and the Katie Couric story. And I think about, particularly in the Black community, there has been for decades such a, there's a real cultural mistrust of
Yes.
institutions, and particularly doctors and physicians. I can think about back in a past iteration of Stacey Walker King, and when I was in high school and wanted to be a doctor and worked for a doctor, but I worked for a physician he grew up in that community, he went to medical school, he came back, and working in that office and seeing the number of people who would come to him. He had 30 people with appointments and 35 other people who were walking in, and he saw them every day, and I thought, these are people who they probably on their way here had to pass 10 doctors, but they would come to him for just, a trust of him that he would take care of them. They knew him. And I just think about, like, these are the types of things that we can help to, just to show in media that people do receive treatment for. This is not something that you have to suffer with alone. There's no shame associated with it. It really is about, there's, resources and tools for you to be able to, get better.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because while this show wasn't in the sample of content that we evaluated, it speaks to what Stacey just mentioned, and it just happened to be a favorite show during the pandemic, so I'm just going to put a little plug in. It's long over, but the series New Amsterdam, and one episode that really struck me is, we know for Black women, maternal mortality, this is a real problem. And they had a whole episode focused on one particular woman's pregnancy and all the issues surrounding potential complications, the way that the staff and what happened with the birthing process. This is the power of entertainment, right? This is the power of taking a social and medical problem and a distrust that's legitimate and bringing it right to the center and broadcasting that into homes, right? Or, on platforms so that people can later screen. It's so palpable. One of the things my students love the most, and I've been teaching for a while now, too long to indicate how long, but they have watched now. I watched Friends in college, but they just watch the show Friends now for fun. And one of the episodes that they love the most that we talk about is when Rachel tells Ross that she's pregnant. And it is one of the funniest episodes of Friends, because he goes on, and everybody's in stitches laughing in the audience, because he's challenging and talking about the effectiveness of condom use, that they're not 100% effective. And I even put a question on the midterm. How effective are condoms, based on the Friends episode? Or I've done it in the past, put it on an exam. But that's the power of entertainment. We can laugh about it. We can cry about it, because the New Amsterdam example was incredibly emotional and compelling, right? But you learned something, and you learned it because it was real and authentic, but it also sensitized you to what someone else might be going through, or what we need to change to make people have a safer environment, right? And so whether it's something that's comedic or something that's dramatic, right? And the two examples that I just brought up, these are things that can be changed by 2026.
Yeah.
And as we talk about change, I think it's really important, because these are not big problems that take forever. Like solving cancer, that's a big problem. Changing the narrative, that's a really simple problem. Anyways, I give those examples off of this issue of the Black community and trust and portrayal. Whoever was behind that portrayal at New Amsterdam, that was really important, right? And that was seen by millions of people, sensitizing them to a really big problem.
Absolutely. And, I think Dr. Smith, as Stacy was mentioning, a lot of your work and your initiative has been pivotal, not just, and I'm thinking about the 4% study, like not just as a way to highlight the data, but to really drive not just change, but accountability. I think so I feel the same way, that having the knowledge of not just the data in film, but also the impact of these diseases together can really drive some of that change that we're hoping to see. Also, I love, Stacy, what you said around, just authentic storytelling and see people as they go through life. I share the same view personally as a Lilly brand beyond a company. We're trying to change what kind of pharma advertising looks like. And I think what you see in a lot of our master brand efforts, just like the authentic human experience and really striving to represent, even casting people with obesity and how they're not typically represented that way in advertising. So I really share the fact that, the best storytelling is real and it's authentic storytelling. I think that's how we can drive change. Speaking of which, then let's just maybe take a second for both of you guys to just give a perspective on what we found in the study around cancer. Because I think, to me, that was, it was all shocking, but it was maybe one of the most shocking pieces of the study. And the reason why I say that is because I don't think there is any one of us in this audience that can say they don't know someone that has experienced cancer, or if, maybe they have experienced themselves. I don't know anyone that doesn't know somebody that has experienced cancer. And yet, when it comes to film, maybe Dr. Smith, you can share some of the data, but it's pretty much inexistent in representation. I think the thing that was the most striking to me was the storytelling around it and the fact that it's basically represented usually as a death sentence. That, to me, was the biggest piece, because as a company, part of what we're trying to make sure that general population gets to understand of, the importance of prevention, the importance of early screening, and the fact that most cancers, when caught early, are treatable. And it's been fascinating for me, working at Lilly, but at the same time being a person and living in this world, how it, I think, is shaped because of TV and entertainment. People get a diagnosis of cancer, and it's often perceived as a death sentence. You don't see that in other diseases because it's been ingrained in us that you can get treatment and you can get better. So of course, cancer continues to be a very challenging diagnosis and a very challenging disease. But the consciousness around this hasn't shifted, and the power that comes in early screening hasn't shifted. And for us as a company, we put so much emphasis to, we would so much rather have people get screened versus get into medicine. So what did we find in the study when it came to cancer?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked. Again, 14 portrayals. And again, I'm just going to look at my notes because I just want you to realize the gravity of this situation. 14 characters, 7 were shown in a hospital setting, 2 deaths, 5 indicated that death was inevitable, and only a few shown with support from family and friends. So 7 in the hospital, 2 deaths, 5 deaths are inevitable. That communicates that it is a death sentence. You're not going to survive. And that is simply not true, right? Now, the insurance component is a whole separate conversation, right?
We'll save this for another time.
We're not going to talk about that. But that's where, really thinking, how would we change this? Like, if I was sitting down to say, how was I going to change this? Well, this isn't about the medical shows just embedding content. It's what is the experiences people actually go through long before they're ever diagnosed, with something that is so scary as that word, right? And there's lots of things, and I'm sure, Stacey, you can talk more about this in terms of macro's perspective, but just thinking about the human experience and how do we change and embed storylines, it's about listening. All of this is just, where are your inputs from? Because if you're spending time generationally with people, you have a very different view of life. If you're around people that are very young, people that are very old, if you're part of the sandwich generation, I'm around college students all the time, so I say things like slay and no cap, right? Like, So it's just really thinking about how do we help this community and really set a challenge, because I find that folks in entertainment want to do good. They're set in a system though that's preventing them from doing good because there's so little time. And once you get a green light or once you get a suggestion, things move really fast. And so it's how do we help people slow down and be listening for these stories and thinking about, like when it comes to obesity, right? That's a hard one because we want to see all shapes and sizes, right? And the entertainment industry focused on the thin ideal for a long time. Eating disorder symptomatology, drive for thinness, objectification, those were all the consequences. So now they're showing shapes and sizes, but then with obesity, it's completely devoid of any health risks associated with characters that are obese, right? And so how do we then incentivize an already creative community that we just need to help listen to really compelling stories that aren't often just coming across their desk? And again, these aren't stories that have to be health focused. These are stories that happen to have health in them, but they represent humanity more accurately. And that's not a hard ask.
Even just, thinking that or showing that obesity is a disease, I think that's such kind of a novel concept for many, or the fact that it's not just a moral failure and it is, a disease like many others. So that could be part of the storytelling. Stacey, as a part, of a production company, how does that play in your mind in terms specifically for cancer? Like how do you think, production companies or storytelling in general being able to shape the perception of cancer?
I think that, I have a lot of things like going through my head that I want to make sure that I don't leave behind. But one of the things that I'll say for sure about this is where this storytelling actually begins. And with Macro, we always start with the story and the storyteller. And, what is the story that you're telling? Is it real? Is it authentic? Is it told with nuance? Is it told with care? These are the things where we start, and that really does start with who's telling that story. I love the example that you gave about the show New Amsterdam, because one of the things that I know about that writer's room is it was one of the most inclusive writer's rooms in probably the history of television. We did a show that was called Raising Dion, and it was about a widowed mother who had an 8-year-old son who was a superhero. And so in our writer's room, sure, we had a lot of parents, we had a lot of things, but we also had one of the parents had a special needs son. And so the way they were able to talk about just, when there were themes of bullying, when there were themes of, I'm dealing with a child that I don't really understand, but I have to be better. There were just elements that they were able to bring to that really, it just made for much more rich storytelling and perspectives that other people in the room, even if they were parents, didn't understand, didn't really relate to, but were like, this is actually something I had never thought about. Yeah. And so that just aha awakening moment was so important. So when I think about specifically in terms of cancer, and and that disease state where we're working on a project right now where one of those characters is a cancer has gotten a cancer diagnosis. And when I think about also as someone who's has had people in my family who've had cancer, and just there are elements to it that this is not it's not something we thought of, this is a death sentence, but also we're looking at how do you this is not doom, this is bloom. How are we all going to come together in this? And so what I would love to see is, show the treatment. Yes, show the fear and the sadness and it is super scary, but I also want to show, so now what do I do next? Okay, and there's my treatment with my doctor. I want to see what active surveillance actually looks like for when someone's in remission. I want to see all of those things, and so I think for us and in the story that we are gearing up to tell, that is a full. I want to see this full life cycle of this person where they have cancer. It doesn't solely define them. Also, what is community look like for them? I think that is really just so important for us. And then the last thing that I'll say, and we talk a lot about what this means for really the person with the diagnosis or the person who has these different diseases. But I know of the, what did you say, like 33 hours a week of TV that people are watching. There are also healthcare professionals who are watching this.
That's very true.
And to think about how they're able to see the perspective of a patient, that it takes it out of the clinical, and it is, what is my bedside manner? How is it affected? How has it changed? How has it improved by what I'm seeing? So again, I go back to just the importance of us having this information, having, a partner who definitely wants to make sure the stories are told. And then the impetus is on us for making sure that we're ensuring that we're seeing the full thing. I don't want to just see the caregiver where, okay, this is the person who has the diagnosis of Alzheimer's and I'm never going to really know what their perspective is. I want to see all of it. And I think it benefits all of us to see all of it because it reflects what some of us are going through, and I think it impacts the way even we can relate to each other.
Yes, absolutely. I also think it's such a good point around, the importance of who's in the writing room and how the writing room is impacted. Because I think, part of the kind of myth to demystify of this is you don't have to just bring to Dr. Smith's point the whole entire medical process. You can still write a funny line. Yeah. You can still, have a great drama or a great comedy, but that, to your point, incorporates the reality of having a disease. And so that maybe cancer is not necessarily a death sentence, so that people with obesity are nuanced, multifaceted, and, have a great life at the same time, but also suffer from a disease. I think Alzheimer's, for me, was another big piece of this study. And I know Dr. Smith is very close to you as well. I think for me was even more shocking maybe where we started before we started the study, which was Alzheimer's at the first glance of data was just being represented in sci-fi genre, and having this moment with loved ones that kind of suddenly brought the memory back, which I thought at the time before we started the work together, what a disservice to people to represent something like that. I know that's very close to your heart as well, but anything maybe you want to share from the study in terms of what we found as well.
There was one finding about dementia that was talking about personally relevant. Just I couldn't believe the caregivers for people with dementia. Right? There's very few portrayals of dementia, but when there was a caregiver, it was a man. And I'm like, sure, some of the time, maybe, right? Because in the real world, it's 65, 70% of caregivers identify as women, right? So again, just a disconnect, right? And these are all things that can be correctable and thoughtful. But again, it's who's behind the camera. And I'm so glad you pointed out the writer's room of New Amsterdam, because the way they also showed the community that's created for cancer, much more authentic, right? I mean, folks that go through that experience, they build an entire team and community of people that, unless you're on the inside, you don't know what it's like when they go. For some people, going to the hospital is a really joyous thing because they've made really strong connections with their medical team. And so whether it's dementia and not seeing an accurate portrayal of care, or, people having these breakthrough moments that, oh, they're back, like The Notebook, right? Like, there's a lot more that can be done because in film and TV, right, the goal is conflict, right? You have to have a conflict. And what's great when we think about narrative elements is that you have the full range of emotions when we talk about disease states. There is, of course, fear and anger, but there's also joy. Mm-hmm. It changes the nature of relationships. And so in thinking about the ways in which we move from invisibility to visibility, I think it's helping people really understand the breadth and depth of these types of portrayals, and that creativity. As soon as you bring more voices in, it's kind of like I'll have a really great class some terms. And it's really great because nobody's the same. Everybody's different. Now, when it's all the same, it's actually really boring, and sometimes it's quiet And the sameness may not be what you expect. It may not be at all what's top of mind, but it's the same thing with writers' rooms, right? The more we get in there and represent different aspects of humanity, the more we're going to see these disease states and others presented in a way that makes more sense and can sensitize healthcare providers that perhaps aren't doing a very good job either.
Yeah, I will, before we move to a Q&A, I have one last question. I'm going to pose that to both of you guys. I'm going to start with you, Stacy, and then end with Dr. Smith. So we've talked, I think we've hinted a lot around what we would like to see change and, and how we would like to go about it. And I think the needs for the entertainment industry and for population at large. In your opinion, what are the key barriers that will prevent us from doing that? Or what would you like to see happening? We touched a little bit on the writing rooms, but how do we drive change? And then I'll get to Dr. Smith.
No, thank you for this question. I would have to say, yes, writers' rooms, but something that we all can do is conversations like this. I think taking these things out of the shadows in our regular lives, that I think is going to be just so key and so critically important. It's something that, like I said, when I read the study, and this is, I work at a company where it's a workforce of people that I'm like, we have some of everybody in there, and which I love. When I'm there, it is not quiet, because it's not a lot of sameness in there, and it's great, and it's exciting, and it's wonderful. But, even thinking about, for me to look at this, and again, not realizing just the starkness of it, and really the opportunity to tell more stories. So I would say, again, it really starts, I think, with all of us to just be, present, to be open with each other, and just to have those real conversations, I think is just going to be incredibly helpful for the change that we want to see. To end up on screen.
For sure. And Dr. Smith, I don't know that I know anyone in the entertainment industry that has driven more change than you have. Real change, not just speaking of change. And so I'm really curious, I think your perspective is not just interesting to me, but it's probably what we need to focus on as we move forward. So from your seat, from being the lead author of this study, from having driven real change when it comes to female representation and just real change behind the camera, what do you think is needed, and what key barriers do you see to drive change in health representation?
Well, I think the good news here is that there are, in fact, no barriers outside of a human's imagination. So that's always the best place to start, right? Because we've all had an experience. Every person that is writing has had an experience. Everyone, whether it's a tonsillectomy, it doesn't matter, right? Whether it's a vaccination at one point in time or not. I mean, no matter what, everyone has had an experience when it comes to health, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing, and I told the folks in music this when we started doing work in music, look, don't take long like film did. Do things differently, because in music, we could be at equality overnight if they didn't listen. So it's never been the year of women in music. It's sad to break it to you, but it's not. Look at our data, and we have more coming later this week. But in health, I think that then the obstacles are invisibility and stereotyping, right? So those are the don'ts. And it's really easy to create a don't profile, right? And then a do profile. Not that it's that easy of a binary, and I think there's some foreshadowing of this, maybe of what's to come, but really calling people like Stacy, bringing people together and saying, look, we're not asking for the world here. We're asking for a look at your slate. I watched 0 Day that dropped on Netflix on my way here. Super fascinating when it comes to dementia. Super fascinating I'm not saying that it had dementia, but they showed one of the central characters, if not the main protagonist, taking prescriptions, and there was a storyline about his cognitive abilities, right? Really compelling. Lots of conversation on our team about this, right? It's not hard. So how do we bring everybody together and say, these are all the problems, we don't need to do these again? Nuanced, authentic, visible. In the least character that says 1 or 2 words, right? Can have something on their arm. I mean, there's just ways that visually we can just bring this into storytelling. And then there's a whole bunch of things that can be done from protagonist all the way down to just the environments that people go into. So for health, I'm really excited. I think calling together the industry, helping sensitize the urgency of the problem, right? Because this is about people's well-being, right? And sometimes when you put it off, it's no big deal. Other times when you put it off, it's a really big deal. We can close that. And so in 3 years, we could have incredibly different findings. Yeah. We could not have a problem. It's just bringing together people like Stacy who are sensible, smart, willing, and that's what you'll find in entertainment. And then how do we get the folks in those rooms and the director writers just sensitized to having a little bit of a wider view? But I think this one is a lot easier because everybody can say, it's happened to me or someone I know. And that helps. Being personally relevant helps.
Thank you. Thank you. That's an extremely powerful point of view. And I'm so excited that we completed the study, that we have the data, that we have people like Stacy joining this conversation and bringing this in places like the stage. Before we
Can I say one
absolutely.
more thing? And I can't underscore how important it is to have a company like Lilly do this, because this benefits everybody. And as soon as we bring more folks in with entertainment, we will see the dividends immediately. But you folks had to take leadership because these things just don't fix on their own.
Thank you. Well, before we conclude this panel, we would like to open up for some Q&A. There should be a mic center here in the middle, so if there are any questions, please walk up to the mic so that our panelists can answer. But so that people probably can hear you, though. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Julia Ralova. This was an amazing panel. I have always been interested in disability on the screen since I was young because I have a brother who is autistic, and that was never something I saw on screen. So this was really informative for me. I'm very excited to dive into the study. But as a filmmaker, I have a question of, are there resources right now to help guide filmmakers who want to write about disease on how to appropriately do so, and or programs that can help with development of these scripts?
Huh.
Lena?
Well, I think as a company and as a medicine company, we share the desire to make sure that those tools are available. So I think, we wanted to start the conversation today, and we believe that's probably where, some of our first steps will be, is partnering together to figuring out how do we give the proper tools to the writing rooms, how do we find partners like Stacy and Macro to potentially join forces so that we continue to educate, and then how, I think it's really a matter, to Dr. Smith's point, to how do we explain diseases from both a technical, scientific perspective, but the human component of that. And one of the things that, like I said, I've been at Lilly for 20 years, and 21 actually. And one of the things that really, in my experience, has differentiated in this company has been the attention to the human, beyond the prescription and beyond the patient. I think as a company, we can hopefully help bring in the human perspective and the insights of patients into some of these tools. So I do think, to answer your question, there's, in my opinion, a severe lack of tools right now, but we're hoping to address that. Dr. Smith or Stacy?
Well, there is one organization that I know, and I'm probably going to get the name wrong, so if I can find you after, it's in my phone, which is not up there. But I believe it's called Ability. But I met them at Sundance, actually, last year. And so one of the things with this organization is specifically that, where they have teams of people that go into writers' rooms, that provide resources and research and data and that, just for this. One of the things I remember in talking to them, that they talk about the number of people who are differently abled today and how that will continue to grow, because every single one of us is susceptible to that. So I will find that organization and I'll give it to you.
And perhaps you're manifesting things to come. Yeah.
Yes, amazing. So look out for Lily, and I'll come find you for that.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jill, and I'm a nurse by training, currently working in research. And I was curious to know, did you guys specifically exclude any series or movie that was about health. So, ER or Grays or the things that you commonly think of, or did they just not happen to show up on the top 100?
Yeah, the sample dictated what we looked at, top 50 broadcasting cable. Now, like a lot of the Chicago shows, nobody's done a Chicago Water and Power in case anybody wants to do one. So we had some, right? Just like across the top 100 films, any theme, as long as it was a new theatrically released film. So what's in the top dictated what we evaluated. So, and like I said, I was bummed New Amsterdam wasn't in there, but if they were there, they were there. But it was dictated by Nielsen ratings.
So do you think that those specific types of shows do a better or worse or comparable job?
Well, you'd have to do a different study, right, of all the medical shows, and then you'd have to compare that information with a series of subject matter experts saying, okay, here's what we know about these disease states. How accurate is this portrayal? Because that's another way to do this type of work. But when they're invisible, and so the question really becomes with some of these other shows, in 2024's sample, we looked at it, it matched 2023, so there wasn't, we were going to find the same thing in 2024. You might see a little more, but these numbers aren't jumping off the page here, especially when the main characters, like with the cancer storylines, are in things like Superman and Lois, or the storylines in film are in horror films, right? So every speaking character, but the sample list will be, I believe, in the report. If not, you can email us and we can share the shows with you.
Thank you.
And maybe one additional point from us, as it was important to look at, to share the recommendation that you provided to look at the top grossing films.
100%.
It was because, again, that's how, if they are the top grossing film and people consume over 33 hours a week of episodic TV, and those are the main ones, that is how culture is shaped. And so that was the approach.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Josh Feldman. Thank you for this incredibly important talk. So I'm originally from South Africa in the UK, and I am the writer, director, and producer of a film called Animal, which deals with the human evolutionary relationship with the consumption of meat. And in this film, we tackle metabolic disease over 2 chapters. And so I'm particularly curious as to your views on the influence of big pharma on Hollywood and the film industry as a whole.
The influence of
Big pharma, big pharmaceuticals.
Pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
And what do you mean by the question? Like,
oh, so their influence, so their kind of infusion into Hollywood, how they dictate what we see from a medical perspective in particular Hollywood films, in documentaries. What are your perceptions on their actual influence on the movie industry?
I don't have a perception on that because, I work in one and we haven't. So, but open to you guys' perspective.
Yeah, so, if you're talking about documentaries, that's different financing structure, different business model altogether. But if I think about the top 100 films or the top TV shows, we're talking about the major studios that are publicly traded companies, right, with shareholders. So I would say extremely low. And so some of those docs that you might be referring to might be picked up and purchased after they're completed, so they acquire them and put them on their platforms, but I would say not much at all.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'd love to have a chat to you afterwards as well, if that's okay. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Brandon. I have a question similar to the young lady asked about the toolkits. I have eczema. I've always had it since I was a kid, and it never really occurred to me to incorporate that into storytelling. How do you recommend, what kind of tips would you recommend in terms of broaching that subject? Because it's part of it. It's like, I never thought about it, but then also I don't want to violate HIPAA laws and be like, hey, do you have eczema? Or anything like that. Like, what type of tips do you recommend in terms of evolving that storytelling to make people feel included to share, but then also making sure that everyone's story gets told, where we're not just singly focusing on one particular disease state or something like that.
I mean, I happen to know someone. And so, it depends if you're telling a comedy or a drama. And I think about my own personal experience of knowing someone that has atopic dermatitis and the challenges that brings to their environment. Sometimes it's hilarious. Sometimes it's tragic, right? It's all the way in between, right? There's a whole series of things that need to be on hand, right? If they have a flare, right? So there's things that can be incorporated, like where did this person go, right? Like, because they might have to take care of a rash, right? These things can be, like I said, extremely serious. They can also be comical, not mocking the disease, but you think about a show, I mean, any comedy, when you turn something on its head. And so for me, it's about the, right, like, humor is a perceived incongruity with the intent to amuse. That's the definition of humor. At least it was in my first dissertation. And the goal is to really then take life and say, I mean, some of these things, if you're like talking about gloves and ointment and Band-Aids and all this stuff, that can be really funny. Just, without going into too much detail, but also painful on other respects. So I just think being cognizant of it, reflecting on it, and talking to other people that are writing with you about the experience, you can come up with something that, I mean, it doesn't exist. It's a wide open field. Like, you could be amazing. You could be the guy, right? And then Lily will be so happy if you're the guy, right? That's what we're trying to get at here. Nobody knows the face of this at all, what any experiences are. And so just about anything can be done when nothing is there. It's a wide open field. It's like pre-AI, right? Like anything can happen.
For sure. No, and I would just add to that is I would also love to see that just the way that it actually functions in life. Sometimes it's, a really big deal. I'm getting ready for a date and I have a flare and this really sucks. And other times it's not even something that, that is thought about. So I think the more we are able to put things in storytelling and normalize it, then I think we're just so ahead of the curve if we're able to do that. And you're the guy.
And you are the guy. I know we could probably spend another 6 hours talking about this. So unfortunately we are at time and we have to end this, but we'll hang out here for a couple of minutes afterwards. I just want to say it has been a long road to be here today to bring the study to life. I am so incredibly proud of the work that we have been able to partner with the USC Amber Institute. I am extremely proud of being on this stage with two incredible women and pioneering your respective fields. And I know that it really starts with knowledge and awareness first. So knowing the data and knowing that there is a problem definition so that we can tackle it in the future. Stay tuned for future announcements of how we may partner. We will continue to partner with the Amber Institute, and we will partner with incredible creators such as Macro, and continue to try to make a difference in how health and life are represented in film. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith and Stacy, for your contributions today and to the industry and the art. Thank you.